we're going to be having a conversation around radical strategies to improve quality in higher education. So if we think about the last decade in education technology, there's been a lot done to increase access. We have from open courseware to YouTube learning to my favorite MOOCs to the proliferation of online degrees. 1 in 6 learners at this point that's getting a degree is doing it online. As we think going forward, and as we saw in the last conversation, it's not just about access, it's also about quality and outcomes. And while there's a lot more that we need to do to promote access, globally only 7% of people have an undergraduate degree. That conversation needs to be married with quality. And that's what we're going to try to do today. So we have a really distinguished panel who has been working on quality and scale in higher education for some time. So there's Rasmussen, who is the founder and CEO of Outlier. Previously was the founder and CTO of Masterclass. Ted Mitchell, the president of the American Council of Education, previously the Undersecretary of Education, and Rachel Carlson, the CEO of Guild. Thank you for being here today. So to get us started, I'd love to hear a little bit about each of your organizations and the work that you're doing to drive quality within your respective organizations. And we can start with you, Rachel.
Great. Hi, everyone. I'm Rachel Carlson. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Guild Education. Is this working fine? Okay, great. And at Guild, we're helping working adults, the frontline workforce of America, to unlock economic opportunity through education. And we're doing that by working primarily with Fortune 1000 employers, as well as leading nonprofit and public universities to help the workforce figure out the connection between education and learning and their workforce potential and help them accelerate into family-sustaining wages and middle-class jobs.
Great. I'm Ted Mitchell. According to my name badge, I work at the U.S. Department of Education. So Secretary DeVos will be much. I know. So thanks for economizing on the name badges. Yeah, thank you. Secretary DeVos will be really excited about this. I am the president of the American Council on Education. We're the umbrella organization representing all of American higher education, 2-year institutions, 4-year. Public, private, for-profit, not-for-profit, and our general effort is to scale access to quality higher education across all of those sectors. And so we're very watchful of a number of quality indicators that would be familiar to all of you: student loan default rates, graduation rates. We work with our institutions to help them improve in all of those measures. In addition to that work, and we do a lot of policy work around those issues. In addition to that work, less known, but I think one of the things that I'd like to talk a little bit about today is that for 50 years now, we have been the military transcript whisperers. And so what we have been doing for those 50 years is translating military experiences and the enormous educational experiences of our veterans into college credit. And so we work not only with the Department of Defense and the various branches of the service, but with our member institutions to make sure that high quality, non-traditional education in that domain is translatable. In addition, we work with employers. We work with employers to do the same thing, to certify training that takes place on the job site and translate that into college credit. And we're excited to be talking with Rachel and her team about how we can expand that. We're also working with Credly, we're working with Parchment, we're working with Coursera, we're working with a number of partners to make that bridge. And in each instance, our job is to stand as the quality assurance provider for those experiences and make sure that they can translate into credit for academic enterprises. And then also not as well known is that we work at the front end of the pipeline as well. We're with Pearson, the owners of the GED testing service. And so we work every day to make sure that students who don't have a high school diploma have access to the training that they need to pass the GED test, and then to a GED certificate that will enable them to go on to higher education. 56%, we talked about this earlier, 56% of the people who pass the GED test go on to our colleges and universities. So it's a significant pipeline. So whether it's policy, improving institutional practice, or certifying non-traditional learning for college credit, ACE is all about scale, or all about quality.
So I'm Aaron Rasmussen, CEO and founder of Outlier.org, and we're a bit newer here. We just launched in August, but the goal is to provide ultra high quality introductory courses at a very reasonable price. So we started with Calculus 1 and Introduction to Psychology, and we sell them for $400. And if you do all the work and you don't pass, you get your money back, which aligns our incentives with the students philosophically. And our credits are provided by the University of Pittsburgh, which has been a really exciting program that we've had with them. So the idea is you can get these high quality credits and you can transfer them into your target university and save, about 4/5 of the cost of your college credits for the introductory courses. Part of the reason this is so exciting is because you can have an incredible amount of impact even in a small number of courses. And there's about 1 million Calculus 1 students every year in the United States alone, and only at the college level. They're spending on average about $2,500 per course. So that means we're spending $2.5 billion a year on Calculus 1 alone, which is a pretty interesting way to think about it. In fact, if you look at the first 25 or so courses, which we're focused on, you see about $50 billion a year in spending. If they are going to take those classes at our rates rather than the average rate, it will put $40 billion a year back into students' pockets. So we have two main missions, which are increase access to high quality education and reduce student debt.
So if we were to break down the classroom, either offline or online, into its component parts, and I recognize this is exactly what Jonathan Katzman asked us not to do in the previous panel, but if we were to break down learning into content, into community, into support, into practice, and think about what aspects drive quality. How do each of you think about it?
I'm happy to jump in here. One of the things we've focused on very heavily is the quality of the video and narrative content in the courses. So I was CTO and creative director at Masterclass, so we had to figure out in that, how do you make this really beautiful online education, which is very focused on unearthing sort of this knowledge that's inaccessible now and democratizing it. This is a bit of a different question, which is how do you teach a very high information density course that's also rather long, and then verify that teaching worked through assessments. So you're looking at a 35-hour course. So while we focused on video, and that's probably the most obvious when you look at our marketing, for lack of a better word, what we found is it's a pretty complex question, what actually makes a good learning experience? I think there is a desire in Silicon Valley to oversimplify things and say, oh, it's just this one factor. But we found that online education is lonely. You want to have a social experience with your peers. You want one-on-one assistance from somebody who knows the topic well. You want a certain type of pacing. Fully self-directed causes problems. Fully locked down on a metronome can also cause problems for various learners. So what we found is, we tried to use the best empirically backed knowledge, of which there's a ton out there, to make the full classroom experience work well. And it's certainly a learning process, but we're pretty excited so far on how it's going.
I'll add a little bit on the support in the community. So we've had the privilege with Gilded working with many universities, both in our network and seeing the tuition reimbursement data across 7,500 schools in the US. And we see them in sort of a natural controlled experiment because we see very similar employees from Walmart, Disney, Discover Financial, Lowe's, who have the exact same job profile. They've done the exact same training on the job. They were hired for the same competencies. They're the same income, same demographic backgrounds. And then we get to watch them progress through different schools. And so, I think everything Aaron just said about content is certainly true. I think the support and the community piece, we can now prove the incremental percentage point improvement that happens depending on what sort of support, both academic support from the school as well as advising, career counseling, retention coaching, management support on the job, all of those factors, we can now see what the value add is, as well as the community that comes from having a peer group who's also working and learning at the same time. And I think the challenging part of that is we've trained American higher ed consumers. If you go ask a student, what are you paying for when you go to school? They say tuition. And then you say, okay, what are you paying for tuition? First thing they say is classes and books. And they're thinking, okay, I'm paying for the professor, I'm paying for the curriculum, I'm paying for the book. The hard part is that's why so many of our B2C models don't put enough into the support and the community aspect, is because we think that consumers don't want to pay for that. One, you can change that, but two, employers feel quite differently. And so we found tremendous willingness to pay from the employers who are actually more interested in paying for the non-commoditized support and community that comes with a learning experience, because they, as mass producers of many things, understand that content can be mass produced, and it's a little bit harder to mass produce the support and the community. So we're actually finding that employers are maybe further along in the belief that if content was king, support's now queen. Let's go that direction.
Great. So I certainly agree with Aaron and with Rachel on this. I think that taking a half step back, we work a lot with Straighterline. We work with Noodle. I think that this issue of learning and the natural experiment is something that we should focus on. We oftentimes grab for what we think is the right solution with partial or limited data. And I think one of the great stories about where we are in higher education, in education innovation, is that we have access, Michael talked a little bit about this already, we have access to information and data at a higher level and a more both higher and more granular at the same time. And so we're able to pick up some of these things. So for us, we've got a natural experiment that's going on with about 2,100 colleges and universities and alternative providers around the country. And so, we don't have the answer, but we're learning. And I think that that's critical to the progress in the field, is to learn, to do experiments, to analyze what's going on, and then to feed that back to the field. We're not very good at that, and that's on us. We need to do a better job at that. But think about for a moment the support issue. If you take the numbers that we don't like, the persistence rate, the graduation rates of institutions, what are the things that seem to be working? Is it more content? No. Is it different kind of support that's based on data? Yeah. And so we're thinking actually at the institutional level about changing the way we're spending, to spend actually less money on content and to think about other ways of supplementing content provision and increase support, community, advising, all of the things that we're starting to learn actually get people through. So I think that this is a really exciting moment for higher education, and I think that this disaggregation question that you started us with is one of the places that we're going to learn the most in the next couple of years.
Mm. And Ted, what role do you see the federal government as playing in that? And it was an area that you pushed on as the former and current Undersecretary of Education. I'd love to hear about some of the work that you pushed on in the Obama administration and what you would like to see the federal government doing going forward, especially as we are getting new data that may suggest different things about quality than the system currently implies.
Yeah, I won't go on into a day by day of the 4 years that we were there, but that the team was in place, or the 8 years that the whole team was in place. But I think that what was critical, and I think one of the things that is in common in this room, is a focus on outcomes. And so I think that needs to be where the federal government and the Department of Education is fundamentally a civil rights agency. And the role of the Department of Education is to make sure that there are opportunities for all Americans and that institutions fulfill their responsibility to provide that opportunity. And the way you do that is by looking at outcomes. And so, for us, I'll just name 3 quick things. First, we believe in transparency and in giving customers, consumers, families, others, policymakers access to data. And so we put together this thing called the College Scorecard. And I think more importantly, we made all of those data available to entrepreneurs and others who want to create tools for students who want to go to college. So transparency is a kind of accountability. Second, we tried to create a pathway for non-traditional providers of high quality to partner with universities and have access to federal financial aid, the EQUIP program, where we tried to bring in innovators while at the same time maintaining a very high quality bar. And then the last thing is that we challenged accreditors to behave differently and to require accreditors not to specify outcomes for institutions, but to have them. May not seem like a big deal, but if you've never done it before, telling institutions that they have to have student outcome measures is sort of a breathtaking opportunity, if you will, for institutions. So that's kind of the path that we were on.
And Aaron and Rachel, how do you think about outcomes in your respective organizations? And Rachel, you started talking a little bit about this, but.
Yeah, so we measure the outcome not just on completion or retention or access, which is, I think, the 3 stepping stones that get said most in higher ed, but actually on economic mobility of the learner. So one, measuring their goals up front, and there's easy mathematical cash-based equations on this. There are also folks who say my number 1 ambition is completing college such that my children go to college. We want to be tracking those sorts of economic mobility metrics as well. And so we're looking at it from, is the person moving up within their company or are they moving beyond the company? And the great news is that, to Michael's slide on ROI, the ROI of retaining a worker now for 3 to 4 years is such that you're comfortable if they ultimately leave the company at 3 to 4. And that's because the turnover rates are so intense, especially amongst actually low wage workers. And so paying for an affordable higher education experience works there. And so what we're paying attention to is that worker mobility upward or beyond, and we're working with the companies to make sure that we're starting there and then working backwards towards which programs should be available to the students, which institutions, which non-traditional programs as well, and thinking of it in that reverse order. I think completion and retention are great metrics that all of us should be vigilantly paying attention to, but I'd love to see the new administration take the next step further of helping us figure out, and I don't know that will happen, but we can do this later, figuring out how to actually measure the opportunity that's created from helping people go back to school. And I think that marries the gap between why are millennials so disgruntled about this higher ed system and yet wildly bullish on learning and development. There's a gap there, and I think it's tied to opportunity creation.
I think one exciting thing is we're going to know more about the way people learn and the outcomes of that teaching in the next 10 years than we'll have ever known before. And if we don't, we've clearly messed up somehow. So when we're thinking about outcomes, we use traditional metrics. We look at completion, we look at DFW rates, who's getting credit. But we also look a bit further, and we've been working with University of Pittsburgh on this as well. So we look at things like NPS, Net Promoter Score. Did this person have a good time in the class? You can get an A in a class and be soured on that topic for the rest of your life. Or you could get a C in a class and suddenly decide you want to become a historian or a computer scientist and have an incredible time that's inspiring. So there is a bit of a disconnect there, and we're really looking to understand how these courses affect students. But secondly, because we do introductory courses, it's incredibly important that our students are prepared for the next course in the sequence. So some of that data will be, something that we sort of have to work very hard for as our students go to other universities, and we have to track their outcomes in the next course up. We'll probably be doing some second courses in the series in our own catalog, which will allow us to very directly measure the outcomes of it. But I think it's a very exciting time to think about outcomes and learning. What is this all for? What is effective here? When we talk to psychometricians, we find out that the whole idea of scoring a student on a 0 to 100 scale, where 100% is 100% correct, is actually basically the worst way to give a test to somebody, because you can't test and validate questions. This is well known in the certification industries and the MCATs and all sorts of things, but we're still in undergrad thinking in this methodology, partly because it's horrifying to many students to get anything but a top score. So I think we have these enormous opportunities coming up as we try all these diverse methodologies in teaching to figure out what the best outcome, most likely metrics, plural, will be. And I don't think we fully know yet, but I think we do have some excellent proxies.
Can I just add to that? Because I think that what both of you are saying is really important, and I don't want to lose it. I think that what we're saying collectively is that the pathway around which we want to measure outcome is different than we imagine it. And it's not just a 4-year degree. That's not the end. You know, this is every commencement speech, right? It's not the end, it's the beginning. That's why they call it commencement. But, I mean, really, you know, we're talking about a path that extends well beyond, and I think I would add to it a path that is increasingly complicated within. So Michael talked about the non-traditional student or the new normal student. And the other thing to remember is that fully a third of students try to transfer credits from one institution to another. And that's both the traditional way you think about it, 2-year to 4-year, 4-year to 4-year, but it's also the pieces of an education that people gather as they're going through life, whether it's the employer-based credit or military-based credit. But the idea of a transcript being a portfolio of experiences instead of just this signpost on the highway, you know, you're now at mile 15, I think is really important. I think you know the number that of the people who do try to transfer, the average number of credits lost is 43%. And so that, you know, this is a major roadblock. And so as we think about outcomes, I think and as we think about broadening both our sense of what the path is like now and what the path is like as we think about adults and adult learning, we need to be aware of some of the impediments that we're putting in place. Aaron and I've talked about this. We're putting together a task force at ACE to try to crack the code on transfer. So stay tuned for that. But I think that this idea of a longer pathway is really important.
So that gets us something interesting. I mean, part of achieving quality, or the challenge of achieving quality, is quality may mean different things to different people. That what they want out of their higher education experience or their lifelong learning might look very different depending on who they are and what stage of life they are. Can you all talk a little bit more about that? Rachel, you work with companies. Aaron, it's still very early and we're still looking at who the students are, but can you talk a little bit about the diversity of students that are coming in and the diversity of students, the diversity of outcomes that they want to experience and how that plays into this conversation around quality?
I can go quickly, which is, I think it starts and ends with economic opportunity. We've yet to meet a student who doesn't have that on some part of their list. Now, it's not number one for every single student, but it is number one for the vast majority. And again, we work with mostly frontline workforces, but are expanding, you know, quickly up into the corporate headquarters, and they care about the same thing. So I think we have to talk about that more in higher ed, and we have to talk about how we can do a better job helping them predict which roles, which functions, which areas are going to create that opportunity. We don't know for sure. They certainly don't know. They feel quite fearful that they don't know. And they actually today trust their CEO and their CHRO to answer that question better than they trust higher ed. And that's a real problem, and we need to change that so they feel like they have a place that they can go and trust has their best interest in mind as they pursue that economic opportunity goal. And then I think there's a number of other goals that only come to the surface if you have a conversation with the student. And so I think you know there's lots of ways to do this in scalable systems, but we all need to be thinking about how do you have that conversation as it relates to what are the outcomes in your local community? What does this look like? You know, it's not telling all truck drivers to learn how to code. It's thinking about which areas are going to facilitate truck drivers becoming drone pilots and which areas are going to facilitate truck drivers becoming skilled electricians, and being really specific about the job openings, the opportunity, and what it looks like in the town they live in the household they live in, and in their family.
I mean, it's pretty early on for us, but it's been really exciting to see the diversity of students in our student body. You know, even in our beta, our youngest student was 18 and our oldest was 73. You know, people are definitely coming to it for a few different reasons. You know, of course, we see many with the kind of initially intended purpose of wanting to get lower cost education and transferring it into their degrees to save some money. We also have a secondary tranche which very much wants to get back into college, whether it's they want to go back and retrain, or they want to finish their original degree, or they have a few credits, or they simply skip that part of their life. We also see all of these alternate routes that, you know, especially Gen Z is looking at, where they might take a gap year. And that's a very exciting, fun thing to do, but it might make sense to not entirely put your education on hold. One kind of fun anecdotal thing was we, love to run surveys. And one of our survey questions was, why are you taking this course? And we got a huge number that said, well, because I want to further my understanding of the topic. We're like, oh, interesting. There's a lot of people that just saw this and thought it'd be a really fascinating thing to take. Well, when we try to dive deeper on it, they're like, oh, we also need the credit to transfer. But I loved the idea that the number one reason was, hey, this looks really, really cool and I'd like to know more.
So I think focusing on the learner and finding out what the learner defines as success is the key component. I think that there's a mismatch between that and traditional institutional development that my members are certainly working on. The institution is built to do something different than respond to every individual. However, they have always been somewhat responsive, right? How many of you have had a minor in college in addition to your major? Right. So institutions have, in a variety of different ways, tried to provide opportunities for individuals to customize. But I think that that's going to become more and more important. The other thing that we haven't talked a whole lot about is policy. I think when we talk about the diversity of students and the diversity of student experience and coming and going and re-entering, most of our federal policies and many of our state policies are still built on the idea that all students are 18 to 22. They're taking full-time to be students. And so whether it's financial aid, the availability of aid over a lifespan, Jim Runcie, who used to run federal student aid, is here today. All of those are still crippled in this new environment by their sort of root allegiance to this old model.
There was a Gallup poll that probably many of you saw that came out in December that was pretty concerning. It showed that young adults, only about 40% of them believe that higher education is very important. And this is down from about 72% just 6 years ago. So that's a huge decline over a 6-year period in young adults' perception of higher education. And this is at the same time when we know that the labor market needs more and more advanced skills. So Rachel, you started getting at this, but I'd love to hear all of your thoughts on, can you explain that? How do you make sense of that?
Yeah, I don't lose any sleep about that poll, and I don't mean to critique the way it was written, but I think there's a term problem in there, because to decide learning and development have never been more important. And I think the core difference is higher education is capital H, capital E, and it's come to mean an institution. And we're in a period of deep distrust of institutions amongst nearly everyone under 40, and then a whole lot of folks over that as well. And last night was a great indication of that. If anyone's watching Iowa speeches, we're in an anti-institutional era. I think learning is lowercase l. And I think we see tremendous desire. In fact, it is indeed not even just millennials. Every group we spend time with learning is the number one thing they're asking for from their employer. And you could even say maybe it's capital L, but it's the institution's the employer. And it turns out we're in an era where people trust their employer more than institutions like higher education and the government. And so I think separating those two concepts, the answer is probably in there.
So Brandon Bastide, I'm going to get this number wrong and you're going to correct me. Only 20% of workers said that they would return to their institution of higher education for future upskilling. I think that's a bigger problem for us than the 40% number. Because the 40% number really does reflect an overall narrative about institutions. It reflects the combination of two things that are working against traditional higher education. One is that it is so necessary, and two is that there is a perception that it is, and it is, very expensive. And so if it were less expensive and necessary, or not necessary and expensive, I think you would have a very different set of attitudes. But I think that combination is really a difficult one for families to navigate, for students to navigate, and for institutions.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of active advertising and storytelling around the idea that higher education isn't somehow necessary. And I think that's affected those poll numbers. When we look at coding boot camps, for example, not to knock those too much, but if you tell an 18-year-old you can go to this boot camp for 6 weeks and come out making an average of $105,000 a year, it's a pretty tempting concept. Or you tell them that, oh, you should drop out and do a Teal Fellowship and become a billionaire. So these narratives tend to come towards the top because it's hard not to want to take what sounds like an easy route. I think there's a real danger to that. Obviously, you know, we hired a lot of kind of coding boot camp engineers before, and you know, there's a lot of additional training that can be an excellent career change, but because there's so much active effort right now to say, oh, you don't need an undergraduate degree, I think we're going to see even further sentiment changes on this. Then on the flip side, you talk to some Gen Z and they say, well, master's is the new bachelor's and a PhD is the new master's, so it looks like I'll be in school for the next 8 years. This is a disconnect, and I think the polls are not going to be reflecting what students actually choose to do frequently, because we still have the pressure of the current generations guiding these students and suggesting that maybe an undergraduate degree is in fact a very good thing. It certainly served the rest of us well.
I'm going to open up for questions. One question, a really good question. Yes.
So, regarding the boot camp that you talked about, Aaron, sort of have value, how much do you think the narrative changes in a recession? Because all the stuff we're involved in didn't exist 10 years ago. And when the labor market gets tighter, does the degree then become valuable again to change that narrative?
Yeah, that's a hard one for me to predict. I think it's culturally really, really different. You know, I was kind of just graduating undergrad when the recession hit, and it felt at the time like higher education was a safety net. So a lot of people sort of returned to it for masters or made sure to finish their undergrad degree. I think that, you know, Gen Z especially, who watched recession go by as children, will have a different response to it. So I don't know what a recession right now would cause students to do and to cling to, but in general, it seems that, you know, in a moment of fear, people will cling to what they already know, and for a very long time, an undergrad degree has been what we know, and for the future, and I think quite a while, it will be what we know.
I think I concur with that.
Great.
Agreed.
Great. Thank you all very much.